December 7th, 1941. The Japanese have attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, and now America has been drawn into the Second World War. This part of the history of World War II from 1941 to 1944 was made before the war was over. It was produced at a time when it seemed that the United States had overcome the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, and with its allies would now be able to overwhelm the dictatorships and bring freedom again to the people of the world. But we are far from victory when this history of American involvement in World War II begins. We, and what remains of the free world, are much closer to desperation.
There never was a blacker Christmas for the civilized world than the Christmas of 1941. Millions of people had lost their homes, their families, their countries. And millions more had lost their lives. Four-fifths of all the people in the world were involved in the greatest struggle in history. In Europe, Germany had occupied Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, made satellites of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland, poured her troops into Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and 50,000 square miles of Russian territory. Fascist Italy had seized Albania and Ethiopia in Africa. And even before these nations were overrun, Japan had occupied Formosa, Korea, and part of China. French Indochina, with the consent of the Vichy regime, had become a Japanese base. In violation of her treaties, Japan had fortified the Marshall, Caroline, and the Mariana Islands. Cordell Hull, American Secretary of State, had used every means at his disposal to check Japanese aggression. In November 1941, Americans hoped that his efforts were meeting with success, when the Japanese sent Saburo Kurusu, a special envoy, by plane to Washington. But Kurusu's trip was only a smokescreen. Even while the negotiations were in progress, Japanese aircraft carriers loaded with planes had started out for Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. It was the logical target, this great naval base in the Hawaiian Islands, 2,500 miles from California, 3,000 miles from Japan. The sneak attack succeeded in sinking or damaging 19 American ships, destroying 150 planes and killing 3,077 men. By crippling this naval base, Japan became temporarily master of the Pacific, and Germany and fascist Italy declared war on the United States. England, the last fortress of resistance in the West, lay only a few miles from Nazi-dominated Europe. The cities were under constant bombardment by the Germans. Russia, bearing the brunt of the vast German attack, had had to evacuate all of her great industries and rebuild them hundreds of miles from the war fronts. The people of China had been forced to carry whole factories back out of range of the Japanese advance. Only America, free from bombing and invasion, was able to produce to her full capacity. But her factories were not yet equipped for war. An industrial miracle had to be performed. Factories had to be rebuilt, retooled. The machines of peace removed. Those of war built and installed. Men who had made automobiles learned to make tanks and planes. Men who had repaired watches now made precision flight instruments. Women who had been housewives learned strange new skills. A peacetime army of 800,000 had to be built up to an army of millions. Men who had been farmers, fishermen, clerks, factory workers, bookkeepers, had to learn to fight. At first, they had to drill with wooden guns and trucks for tanks. The people of the United States, like others, had learned in a bitter lesson. They could not remain isolated from the rest of the world. They were drilling and preparing, learning to carry their share of the burden. And the armies of the United Nations were growing. The Americans, the British and men from the great British dominions, Russians, Chinese, Czechs, Greeks, men from India, free Norwegians who had escaped from Nazi-dominated Europe, Yugoslavs, Dutch, Javanese, Poles, Danes, Luxembourgers, and Belgians, Filipinos, and free Frenchmen rallying to the fight under the standard of General de Gaulle. Great oceans separated the Allied powers. The shipping lanes were the lifelines of the United Nations. With the British and the American navies spread thin over the 5 oceans, the German U-boats became bolder. This was the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942. In 10 months, the Allies lost over 500 ships. With each of these sinkings went down tons of desperately needed supplies for the fighting fronts in Russia, England, and Africa.
This was the Russian front in 1942. The Germans advanced, looting, torturing, murdering as they went. The casualties ran into the millions. They had driven 1,000 miles deep into Russian territory, into the wheat fields of the Ukraine, the great industrial centers of the South. But Russia, with her scorched earth policy, left nothing of value behind. Wheat which could not be harvested was set afire. Bridges were blown up, dams, railroads, power plants. Nothing was left that might be of use to the enemy. Old men, women, and children who had lost their villages became guerrilla fighters. They formed bands to sabotage and harass the Germans from behind the lines. The main German offensives were directed against Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the Caucasus in the south. The Russians, in desperate battles, counterattacked and checked the advance on Leningrad and Moscow. But in the south, on July 1st, 1942, after a siege of 180 days, Sevastopol fell. The German army now massed for an all-out drive on Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The conquest of the Caucasus and the capture of Stalingrad would block Russia's vital Middle East oil supply and make this oil available for the German war machine. Simultaneously in Africa, other German forces were driving for Suez to cut the British lifeline of supplies.
This was the North African front in 1942. The outnumbered and poorly equipped British Empire and fighting French forces had to retreat before the German advance. They were driven back across the desert to El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria, key to the Suez Canal.
And on the Pacific front in 1942, the Japanese had spread like locusts over the eastern archipelagos. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had taken the American outposts of Wake and Guam. Hong Kong fell. Thailand yielded. The Philippines fell. And in swift succession, Singapore, Burma, the Netherlands East Indies, New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. Attu and Kiska in the American Aleutian Islands. The Allied line of defense in the Pacific was pushed back to an arc which pivoted on the Hawaiian Islands in the center. Near Pearl Harbor, and essential to its defense, is the American outpost of Midway. If this defense line were to be breached, the United States Navy would be swept from the Pacific. On June 3rd, 1942, American patrols sighted Japanese warships and troop transports several hundred miles out at sea, heading for this island of Midway. Upon Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Central Pacific Front, rested a grave responsibility. He decided that this was the place to make a stand and committed all available ships to a bold attack. The future of the Pacific lay in the hands of these young naval aviators. This was a new kind of sea battle. The two fleets were never within sight of each other. Aircraft carriers, great floating airports, served as bases from which the planes took off to attack the opposing fleet over 100 miles away. The Battle of Midway set the pattern for other sea battles which followed in the Pacific. While the American planes were on their mission, Japanese planes in turn attacked the American fleet.